In the year 2000, the CEO of a small, struggling DVD postal service flew to Dallas, Texas. He sat across a table from the most powerful video rental company on earth. He asked for $50 million. dollars. The Blockbuster executives laughed at him. That man was Reed Hastings. That company was Netflix. At its peak, Blockbuster UK had over 800 stores. On a Friday night in 1998, 1 in 4 British families walked through those blue and yellow doors. The sign was as familiar as a pub on the corner. Children pressed their faces against the glass before the door opened. Couples argued in the aisle between action and comedy. Teenagers hovered near the 18-rated shelf, hoping nobody would notice. The membership card sat in every wallet in the country, slightly warped, slightly sticky, completely essential. By November 2013, every single store in Britain was dark. How does a company so completely woven into British life, so deep in the fabric of Friday nights and school holidays and rainy Sunday afternoons, simply disappear? And did it have to end this way? That is the question this film will answer. David Cook was not a film lover. That is the first thing to understand about the man who built Blockbuster. He was not a cinephile with a dream of bringing great cinema to the masses. He was not a frustrated projectionist or a passionate video collector. David Cook was a software engineer from Dallas, Texas, who had spent his career building database systems for the oil and gas industry. When the oil market collapsed in the early 1980s and his software business dried up with it, he looked around for somewhere else to apply what he knew. What he saw was chaos. The video rental business in 1985 was a mess. Small independent shops stacked tapes in no particular order. Staff had no reliable way to track inventory. Customers drove across town only to find the film they wanted was already out. Nobody knew what was in stock, what was overdue, or what was popular. To Cook, it was not a cultural problem. It was a data problem. And data problems he knew how to solve. He opened the first Blockbuster video in Dallas, Texas, on the 19th of October, 1985. The store was unlike anything the video rental business had seen. It was 8,000 square feet, enormous by the standards of the time. The tapes were organized by genre alphabetically, with the actual box displayed face out on the shelf rather than hidden behind a counter. A computerized system tracked every single rental in real time. Customers could walk in, browse freely, find what they wanted, and know whether it was available before they even reached the counter. Cook's core belief was straightforward. Make it easy, make it big, make it reliable. He was not selling films. He was selling the certainty that the film you wanted would be there when you wanted it. In 1985, that alone was a revolution. The store was an immediate success. Within a year, Cook had opened more locations across the Dallas area. Within 2 years, he had attracted the attention of a Miami businessman named Wayne Huizenga, who saw something in the Blockbuster model that Cook himself had not fully imagined. Huizenga did not see a regional video shop. He saw a national chain. In 1987, he purchased a controlling stake in Blockbuster and took over as chairman. Cook departed. What happened next had very little to do with Cook's original vision, and everything to do with Huizenga's appetite for scale. Huizenga expanded Blockbuster at a speed that was, even by American standards, remarkable. New stores opened at a rate of 1 every 17 hours at the peak of the expansion. The formula was consistent: large footprint, bright lighting, family-friendly environment, no adult content on the shelves. Huizenga wanted Blockbuster to feel safe. He wanted parents to bring their children. He wanted the brand to sit alongside McDonald's and Walmart in the landscape of American family life. Dependable, clean, everywhere. By 1989, Blockbuster had over 1,000 stores in the United States, and Huizenga was ready to cross the Atlantic. The first Blockbuster in the United Kingdom opened in 1989 in South Ruislip, a suburb in the London borough of Hillingdon in West London. The location was not chosen by accident. South Ruislip was exactly the kind of place the Blockbuster model was designed for. Suburban, family-oriented, high car ownership, a population of working and middle-class households with televisions, VHS players, and Friday nights to fill. There was no independent video shop on that particular stretch of road capable of competing with what Blockbuster was about to bring. The store followed the American template precisely. Wide aisles, genre sections clearly marked. New releases on the back wall, their boxes bright and prominent under strip lighting. A membership desk near the entrance, where staff processed new cards with an efficiency that felt, in 1989, almost futuristic. The carpet was dark blue. The signage was bold yellow and blue. The whole space smelled of new plastic casing and fresh carpet, a smell that, for an entire generation of British children, would become inseparable from the excitement of Friday night. From that single store in South Ruislip, Blockbuster UK began to grow, first across Greater London, then into the Midlands, the North, Scotland, Wales. Each new store carried the same layout, the same signage, the same membership card, the same promise. Wherever you were in Britain, a Blockbuster was coming to a retail park near you. What David Cook built in Dallas was a system. What Wayne Huizenga carried to Britain was a brand. But what British customers made of it, in their own towns on their own Friday nights, was something neither man had designed or anticipated. That part happened on its own, quietly, over a decade, one rented tape at a time. Close your eyes and go back to a Friday afternoon in 1997. School is finished for the week. The working day is done. Somewhere in Britain, in a semi-detached in Wolverhampton, in a terraced house in Leeds, in a new build on the edge of a retail park in Swindon, someone is already thinking about it. Not what film to watch. Not yet. Just the fact of going. The anticipation of walking through those doors and standing in front of that wall. That was the Blockbuster ritual. And for the better part of a decade, it was one of the most reliable pleasures of British life. The physical experience of a Blockbuster store in the mid-1990s was specific enough that anyone who was there can reconstruct it immediately. You pushed open the door and the security sensor beeped. Not because you had done anything wrong, but because that was simply the sound of arrival, the sound of the place acknowledging you. The lighting was bright and flat, the kind that made everything look slightly more vivid than it did outside. The carpet underfoot was dark, practical, slightly worn near the entrance where thousands of feet had crossed before yours. The air carried a particular smell, the faint chemical warmth of plastic cases, the slight staleness of a busy enclosed space, and underneath it, if you were near the counter, the faint sweetness of popcorn. The layout was immediately legible. New releases occupied the back wall, the prestige section, the reason most people came in. The boxes were full size, face out, lined up in rows that stretched the width of the store. On a Friday evening, the most wanted titles were already gone, their empty cases left on the shelf like placeholders for something that might come back. Regular customers learned to go early or to scan the previously viewed section along the side wall, where ex-rental copies could be bought outright for £3 or £4. That section had its own loyal constituency, people who preferred the slightly battered case and the guarantee that what was inside was worth watching. Family, action, comedy, horror, thriller, drama. The genre signs hung from the ceiling in yellow and blue, pointing the way with the confidence of a department store. Children's films occupied their own section near the entrance. Accessible, deliberately placed where small hands could reach them. In the late 1990s, a new section began to appear in the larger stores. Console games, PlayStation cartridges and later PlayStation discs, Nintendo 64 games, Sega Saturn titles lined up in their own alcove, each one rentable for a weekend for a fraction of the purchase price. For children whose parents would not spend £40 on a game they might not enjoy, this was transformative. You could try Gran Turismo on a Saturday, return it Monday, and try something else the following weekend. The membership card was the key to all of it. A small laminated rectangle, blue and white, with a barcode down one side and a membership number that you eventually memorized without trying. Every household had at least one. Many had 2 or 3, accumulated over years as cards expired and replacements were issued. The card lived in a wallet or kitchen drawer, and its presence there was entirely unremarkable. As ordinary and expected as a library card or a supermarket loyalty card. To lose it was a minor inconvenience. To find an old one years later in the pocket of a coat not worn since 2001 was to hold a small piece of your own past. The staff were part of the experience in ways that are difficult to quantify now. They were mostly young, sixth formers, students, people in their early 20s earning weekend money, and the better ones had opinions. Some stores maintained handwritten recommendation cards, slipped into a cardboard sleeve and propped against the relevant box. Brilliant if you liked Fargo. Slow start, but worth it. Not as good as the book, but still great. These recommendations carried a weight that no algorithm has since replicated because they came from a specific person in a specific place who had actually watched the film and chosen to say something about it. The occasions that brought people to Blockbuster were as varied as the people themselves. Friday night was the primary event, but it was far from the only one. Bank holiday Mondays generated their own surge. The long afternoon with nowhere particular to be and a television waiting. School holidays meant children in the shop at opening time, negotiating with parents over the family section. New Year's Eve was a quiet ritual for couples who preferred a film at home to the ordeal of going out. And birthdays, children's birthdays especially, often included a trip to Blockbuster as part of the occasion itself. The child allowed to choose two films without argument, a concession that carried real weight. The cultural moments that passed through Blockbuster's shelves during those years track the decade precisely. The Titanic VHS release in 1999, over 3 hours on 2 tapes, the cases sold and rented simultaneously, generated cues that staff at the time still recall. The release of the original Star Wars trilogy on VHS in the mid-1990s, remastered and repackaged, emptied shelves within days. When a film finished its theatrical run and arrived at Blockbuster, it felt like a second premiere, a second chance for audiences who had missed it first time round. The shop was a bridge between the cinema and the living room, and for millions of British families who could not afford cinema prices regularly, it was the more important of the two. What made the experience irreplaceable was not the films themselves. Films could be watched anywhere, eventually. What was irreplaceable was the choosing, the standing in front of the wall with another person and negotiating, compromising, persuading, the picking up of a box, reading the back, putting it down, the moment of decision at the counter, the drive home with the case on the back seat. These were the small social acts that Blockbuster made possible, and they were woven into relationships and families and friendships in ways that nobody thought to value until they were gone. What was it about choosing a film together, in person, under those fluorescent lights, that felt like more than just picking something to watch? The answer, of course, is that it was never really about the film. It was about the Friday night. It was about the ritual of leaving the house with a purpose, of standing in a bright lit space with the people you loved, of coming home with something to look forward to. Blockbuster did not invent that need, but for nearly 2 decades, it was the place that met it. By the late 1990s, Blockbuster UK had become something its founders had not designed, and its executives in Dallas had not fully understood: a piece of British social infrastructure. Not a shop so much as a weekly appointment, not a brand so much as a habit. And habits, as anyone who has ever tried to break one will tell you, feel permanent right up until the moment they are gone. The trouble, when it came, did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. It began, as most serious trouble does, quietly, in a boardroom 3,000 miles away, in a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. Wayne Huizenga did not build Blockbuster to be a video shop. He built it to be sold. That is the second thing to understand about the company behind the blue and yellow sign. Huizenga was not a retailer by instinct. He was a deal maker. He had already built and sold 2 major American businesses before Blockbuster: waste management and AutoNation. His method was consistent across all 3. Identify a fragmented industry, apply a standardized corporate model, scale aggressively, sell at the peak. Blockbuster was not an exception to this pattern. It was its most successful execution. Between 1987 and 1994, Huizenga expanded Blockbuster from a regional Dallas chain into a global entertainment brand. The growth was extraordinary by any measure. At its most aggressive, a new Blockbuster store was opening somewhere in the world every 17 hours. In the United Kingdom, The rollout followed a clear strategic logic. First, the major suburban areas around London, then the Midlands, then the North, then Scotland and Wales. The stores went where the car went. Retail parks, ring roads, the edges of market towns, the new housing estates that were spreading across Britain throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The high street was a secondary consideration. Blockbuster wanted car parks, not pavements. The expansion in the UK was pursued through a combination of corporate-owned stores and franchise agreements. Some operators were granted franchise rights to open Blockbuster-branded stores under license, following the corporate template precisely in exchange for a share of revenue. Others were directly owned and managed by the company. The result from the customer's perspective was seamless. Every store looked the same, felt the same, smelled the same. The consistency was the point. You could walk into a Blockbuster in Brighton and a Blockbuster in Inverness and find the same layout, the same signage, the same membership card working at both counters. That reliability was a genuine competitive advantage in an era before the internet made price and availability instantly comparable. What the expansion destroyed, quietly and completely, was the independent video shop. Throughout the 1980s, Britain had developed a thriving ecosystem of local video rental businesses. Corner shops that kept a rack of tapes behind the counter. Dedicated video libraries run by families who knew their customers by name. Small chains of 2 or 3 stores in a single town built up over years by people who had taken a risk on the home video boom and made it work. These businesses could not compete with Blockbuster on stock depth, on store size, on the reliability of their inventory systems, or on the sheer weight of the brand's national advertising. When a Blockbuster opened in a town, the independent shops began to close. Not immediately and not always completely. Some survived by carving out niches, stocking foreign language films, or specialist genres that Blockbuster did not carry. But the general direction was one way only. For every Blockbuster that opened, the surrounding streets lost something that had, in many cases, been a genuine community business. The man who had been renting films to the same families for 8 years, who knew that Mrs. Patterson always wanted something with subtitles and that the Hendersons never returned anything on time. He was gone. In his place was a corporate store staffed by rotating part-time employees who were trained to a standard but connected to nobody. This was progress by any conventional metric. It was also a loss that was never counted. The Viacom acquisition in 1994 was the moment the story changed direction permanently, though almost nobody recognized it at the time. Sumner Redstone, the chairman of the American media conglomerate Viacom, purchased Blockbuster for approximately $8.4 billion. It was on the surface a logical deal. Viacom owned Paramount Pictures and MTV, among other entertainment assets. Blockbuster was the dominant distribution channel for home video in the English-speaking world. The combination looked like vertical integration, a studio owning the shop that sold its product. Redstone called it a marriage of content and distribution. What it actually was, in retrospect, was a debt transfer. Viacom loaded the acquisition cost onto Blockbuster's own balance sheet, leaving the video rental chain responsible for servicing billions of dollars in debt from the very moment the deal closed. Blockbuster had been a profitable business before the acquisition. It would never be straightforwardly profitable again. Every decision made by Blockbuster's leadership from 1994 onwards was made under the shadow of that debt. Every investment weighed against interest payments. Every innovation delayed by the pressure to generate cash for a parent company that had used the acquisition as a financing mechanism rather than a genuine strategic commitment. In the UK, none of this was visible. The stores continued to open, the signage went up on new retail parks, the membership cards were issued in their millions. From the outside, from the perspective of a family in Nottingham deciding where to spend their Friday evening, Blockbuster looked as solid and permanent as ever. The debt was an American problem, recorded in American accounts, discussed in American boardrooms. It would take nearly a decade for its consequences to reach the British high street, but the clock had started, and it was already running. By the mid-1990s, Blockbuster UK was approaching the height of its powers. 800 stores, millions of members, a place in British life that felt, to anyone paying attention, entirely secure. The company had seen off every competitor it had faced so far. The independent shops were gone. The rival chains had been acquired or had retreated. The brand was everywhere, and it was trusted. What nobody in the company's leadership was paying sufficient attention to was a development happening not in retail, but in technology. A small experiment in California, beginning in 1997, in which films were posted to customers through the mail in thin red envelopes. No store, no membership card, no late fee, just a film arriving at your door and a prepaid envelope to send it back. It seemed to the executives in Dallas entirely unthreatening. They were wrong. There is a specific kind of Saturday morning that anyone who worked in a Blockbuster store during the late 1990s will remember without prompting. It began before the store opened. The returns slot in the front door had been collecting overnight. Films dropped back through the letterbox by customers on their way home from something, or pushed through at midnight by someone who had suddenly remembered the due date. By the time the first member of staff arrived to open up, there would be a small pile of cases on the floor inside the door. Some of them rewound properly, most of them not, a few of them still warm from the night before. The job of the opening shift was to sort them, check them, rewind the ones that needed rewinding. There was a dedicated rewinding machine behind the counter, a small device that did nothing else, and return them to the shelves before the first customers of the day arrived. Those customers came early. Weekend mornings were busy in a way that surprised people who only visited on Friday evenings. Families returning last night's rental before the late fee clock ran any further. Children who had been allowed to choose the previous night's film now returning to choose again. Regulars who came every Saturday as a matter of habit, not urgency, because the shop was part of their weekend in the same way that the newsagent or the supermarket was part of it. Not exciting exactly, but woven in. By the mid-1990s, Blockbuster UK had reached something beyond commercial success. It had achieved cultural saturation. The stores by this point numbered in the hundreds across Britain, covering virtually every significant town and suburb from Plymouth to Aberdeen. The brand's geographic reach meant that Blockbuster was, in a genuine sense, a shared national experience in a way that very few retail brands achieved. It crossed class lines with unusual completeness. The store in a prosperous Surrey commuter town and the store on a Sunderland housing estate carried the same stock, issued the same membership card, charged the same rental price. The family in the detached house and the family in the council flat both had a Blockbuster card in the kitchen drawer. Both of them came in on Friday night. Both of them stood in front of the same new releases wall. In a country where class determines so much of daily experience, this was more significant than it might appear. The peak location count, approximately 800 stores across the United Kingdom, was reached somewhere around the late 1990s, and the figure itself tells only part of the story. More telling is what those 800 locations represented in the rhythm of British life. Blockbuster had become a landmark in the most literal sense. It was a navigation point. Meeting someone after work. "I'll see you outside Blockbuster." Explaining where you live to someone unfamiliar with the area. "Turn left at the Blockbuster. It's the third on the right." The blue and yellow sign had joined the pub, the post office, and the chip shop as one of the fixed coordinates of the British townscape. The generational transmission of the habit was, by this point, well established. Parents who had joined Blockbuster in 1990 were now bringing children who had no memory of a time before it. Those children were developing their own relationship with the store, one that was less about films and more about the freedom of choosing. The child who was allowed to pick the Friday night film without parental veto was exercising a form of domestic authority that felt, at 7 or 8 years old, genuinely significant. The choice mattered. It was taken seriously. It was negotiated over in the car on the way there, and occasionally reversed in tears in the car on the way home. The console game section that had appeared in larger stores by the mid to late 1990s deepened this relationship considerably. The arrival of the PlayStation in the UK in September 1995, followed by the Nintendo 64 in 1997, created an entirely new reason to visit Blockbuster that had nothing to do with films. Games cost £40 or more to buy outright, a significant sum for a household with children, and the quality varied enormously. Renting a game for a weekend for £3 or £4 was a rational response to this uncertainty. Blockbuster understood this quickly and stocked accordingly. For a generation of British children, the weekend game rental became as established a ritual as the Friday night film. Perhaps more so because it carried a different kind of excitement. You were not just watching something, you were playing something. You had 2 days to get as far as you could before it had to go back. How many first dates ended with a walk to Blockbuster? How many family arguments were settled in the aisle between action and comedy? The answer, of course, is uncountable. But the question points to something real about what Blockbuster had become by this period. It was a social space in a way that is easy to underestimate in retrospect. People lingered. They browsed without urgency. They talked to each other, to staff, to other customers, occasionally to strangers who happened to be holding the same box and wondering the same thing. The shop was not merely a transaction point. It was a place where decisions were made together, where tastes were negotiated, where the small diplomacies of shared life were conducted in public. The Christmas period made all of this visible at maximum intensity. From late November onwards, Blockbuster stores operated at a different register entirely. The new release shelves were restocked more frequently. Seasonal displays appeared near the entrance. The queue at the counter stretched back into the aisles on Christmas Eve, and on the dead days between Christmas and New Year, when families were home together, slightly overfed and in need of something to do. Staff worked longer shifts. The return slot filled faster. The previously viewed section was raided for last-minute gifts. A slightly battered copy of a film someone had mentioned wanting to see, wrapped and placed under the tree with the Blockbuster sticker still on the case. This was Blockbuster at its most powerful. Not as an entertainment company, but as a piece of British domestic infrastructure. Invisible in the way that all essential things are invisible. Noticed only when absent. Taken for granted precisely because it was always there. But even now, even at the absolute height of the brand's reach and confidence, the first shadow had already appeared. It was small, and it was American, and it had arrived in the post. In 1997, a software engineer in California named Reed Hastings had co-founded a company called Netflix. The initial concept was simple: DVD rental by mail. You ordered online, the disc arrived in a red envelope, you watched it, you posted it back in the prepaid sleeve provided. No store, no late fee, no membership card to carry, no driving anywhere on a Friday night in the rain. Blockbuster's leadership in Dallas was aware of Netflix from its earliest days. They were not concerned. A postal DVD service seemed, in 1997, like a niche proposition, suitable perhaps for film enthusiasts willing to wait 2 days for a delivery, but no threat to the immediacy and convenience of walking into a shop and coming home with something that evening. The executives had a point. In 1997, they were right. What they failed to account for was what Netflix might become once the internet changed the meaning of delivery. And that failure, so understandable in 1997, so catastrophic in retrospect, was about to define the next 15 years of Blockbuster's existence. The peak was real, the confidence was earned, and the danger was already in the post. In the spring of the year 2000, Reed Hastings flew to Dallas. Netflix had been operating for 3 years. It had approximately 300,000 subscribers, was losing money, and had just survived the first tremors of the dot-com crash with its finances badly shaken. Hastings was not in a strong negotiating position. He knew it, and the men across the table from him knew it. His proposal was straightforward. Blockbuster should acquire Netflix for $50 million, rebrand it as Blockbuster Online, and use it as the company's digital delivery arm while the physical stores continued to operate. The two businesses together, Hastings argued, would be stronger than either alone. The Blockbuster executives listened. Then, according to multiple accounts of the meeting, they laughed. $50 million for a loss-making postal DVD service with 300,000 customers, at a time when Blockbuster had 60 million members worldwide and over 8,000 stores across multiple countries. The proposal must have seemed from inside that Dallas conference room not merely overpriced, but faintly absurd. Hastings was shown the door. He flew back to California, and Blockbuster returned to its business. That decision, made in a single meeting, dismissed without serious consideration, is now one of the most studied failures of commercial judgment in modern business history. Netflix's current market capitalization exceeds $150 billion. dollars. The $50 million asking price in 2000 looks, from this distance, not like an overreach, but like a gift. But the Dallas meeting, for all its retrospective notoriety, was not the first crack in Blockbuster's foundation. It was a symptom of something that had been present since 1994. The company that laughed Reed Hastings out of the room was not a confident, well-capitalized business making a bold strategic choice. It was a debt-burdened company operating under Viacom's ownership, structurally incapable of the kind of long-term investment that acquiring and developing Netflix would have required. The laughter was not arrogance alone. It was also the sound of a company that could not afford to think clearly about the future. Three cracks had opened by the early 2000s, each one distinct, each one serious, and each one ignored for longer than it should have been. The first was the debt. The $8.4 billion Viacom acquisition had placed Blockbuster in a position where profitability was perpetually compromised by interest payments. Every year, a significant portion of the company's revenue went not into store investment, staff development, or digital innovation, but into servicing debt that existed solely because of how the acquisition had been structured. Stores that needed refurbishment were left as they were. Technology investments were deferred. The gap between what Blockbuster looked like at its best and what it looked like in a neglected franchise location began to widen. Customers noticed, even if they could not have articulated precisely what had changed. The carpet was a little more worn, the signage a little more faded, the new release shelf a little less reliably stocked. The second crack was the late fee. The late fee had always been unpopular. From the earliest days of home video rental, customers had resented being charged for keeping a film longer than the contracted period. Blockbuster's late fee structure was, by the standards of the industry, neither unusually harsh nor unusually lenient. But by the early 2000s, it had become something more than an unpopular policy. It had become a genuine liability, a symbol of everything that felt adversarial about the relationship between Blockbuster and its customers. Stories circulated and were believed of fees that seemed disproportionate, of charges applied in circumstances that felt unfair, of the counter staff who delivered the news with an apologetic shrug that made clear the policy came from somewhere above them and beyond appeal. Reed Hastings himself has stated publicly that a $40 late fee on a copy of Apollo 13 was among the experiences that motivated him to found Netflix. Whether the precise details are accurate or slightly embellished for the purposes of a good founding myth, the underlying truth is unambiguous. The late fee created enemies, and some of those enemies built companies. In the United Kingdom, a business called Love Film launched in 2002 with a proposition that was almost entirely constructed around the absence of what Blockbuster charged for. No late fees, postal delivery, a monthly subscription model that allowed customers to have a certain number of films out at any one time, return them at their own pace, and receive replacements automatically. Love Film was not, in its early years, a dominant force. It was small, underfunded, and operationally imperfect. But it found customers immediately, not because its service was flawless, but because its basic promise resonated. The late fee was the thing people hated. Love Film offered the thing people had always wanted, a rental relationship without the penalty. Blockbuster's response to Love Film in the UK was slow, inconsistent, and chronically underfunded. The company launched its own postal service, Blockbuster Online, in 2004, following a similar initiative in the United States under CEO John Antioco. The service was, by most accounts, competitive. In some respects, it was superior to Love Film, but it could not be funded at the level required to win the market because the parent company was managing debt rather than investing in growth. Blockbuster Online was a genuine attempt to respond to the threat, and it was strangled by the same financial constraints that had made the company vulnerable in the first place. The third crack was visible not in the boardroom, but in the car park. Franchise owners, the operators who had invested their own money in Blockbuster-branded stores under license, began to notice a change in footfall somewhere around 2002 in 2003. Not a collapse. Not even a dramatic decline. Just a softening. Friday nights were still busy, but not quite as busy as they had been. The previously viewed section moved a little more slowly. The console game rentals held up, but the film rental numbers were incrementally, consistently down. Individual franchise owners raised these concerns through the available channels and were met with the kind of corporate reassurance that, in retrospect, has a familiar and dispiriting quality. The fundamentals of the business were sound. The brand was strong. The numbers were being monitored. How long could a company this beloved actually last if the people responsible for its future were looking in the wrong direction? The answer was beginning to take shape, not in any single decision or any single year, but in the accumulation of deferred choices. The acquisition not made in Dallas in 2000, the debt not restructured after 1994, the late fee not abolished until it was too late, the franchise owners not listened to until the footfall figures became impossible to explain away. The customers walking into Blockbuster stores in 2003 had no reason to suspect any of this. The lights were on. The new releases were on the wall. The membership card still worked at the counter. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But behind the blue and yellow sign, the foundations were shifting. And in a boardroom in New York, a decision was being prepared that would remove the one man capable of stopping what was coming. John Antioco took over as chief executive of Blockbuster in 1997. He was not the obvious choice. He came from the convenience store and fast food industries, Circle K, Taco Bell, rather than from entertainment or technology. But he understood retail at an operational level that his predecessors had not. And by the early 2000s, he had developed a clear and accurate diagnosis of what was wrong with the company he ran. The diagnosis was uncomfortable because it implicated decisions made before his arrival. But it was correct. And for a period of approximately 3 years, between 2004 and 2007, Antioco pursued a strategy that, had it been allowed to continue, might plausibly have saved Blockbuster. The strategy had 3 components. The first was the elimination of late fees. In January 2005, Blockbuster announced the end of its late fee policy in the United States, under the marketing campaign "No More Late Fees." The response from customers was immediate and measurable. Satisfaction scores increased. New membership registrations rose. The change addressed the single most consistent complaint in the company's history and removed the most powerful emotional argument in love films and Netflix's marketing arsenal. It cost Blockbuster approximately $400 million in annual revenue. Antioco judged that the customer goodwill generated was worth more than the lost income. He was right. The policy worked. The second component was Blockbuster Online, launched in 2004. The service was a direct competitive response to Netflix in the United States and LoveFilm in the United Kingdom, a subscription-based postal and digital rental service that allowed Blockbuster members to order films online and have them delivered to their homes. Critically, Antioco structured Blockbuster Online so that subscribers could also exchange their postal discs in physical stores, combining the convenience of home delivery with the immediacy of the shop. This hybrid model was, in the assessment of most industry observers who have since examined it, genuinely superior to what Netflix was offering at the time. Blockbuster Online was growing. It was taking customers from Netflix. In 2005, Netflix's own internal forecasts acknowledged Blockbuster Online as an existential competitive threat. The third component was a renegotiation of the revenue-sharing agreements with film studios, reducing the upfront cost of stocking new releases and improving the economics of the rental business overall. Taken together, these 3 initiatives represented the most coherent strategic response to Blockbuster's competitive situation that the company ever produced. They were working. And then Carl Icahn arrived. Icahn was an activist investor, a billionaire with a history of acquiring significant stakes in underperforming companies, agitating for changes in management and strategy, and extracting value through the disruption his interventions created. He had accumulated a large shareholding in Blockbuster and had secured seats on its board of directors. His primary objection to Antioco's strategy was financial. The elimination of late fees had cost $400 million in annual revenue, And Blockbuster Online was running at a loss as it competed aggressively with Netflix on price. In Icon's assessment, the company was spending money it did not have on a strategy whose returns were too slow and too uncertain. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable as a piece of short-term financial analysis. What it entirely failed to account for was the alternative. If Antiocho's strategy was expensive, the alternative, retreating from the online market, reinstating late fees, and returning to a pure physical rental model, was not a path to profitability. It was a path to faster irrelevance. Akan was applying the logic of financial engineering to a company that needed the logic of strategic survival. The two were not compatible. The conflict between Icon and Antiocho consumed Blockbuster's boardroom for the better part of 2 years. It was conducted through shareholder letters, public statements, and the accumulated friction of a board divided between those who understood the competitive landscape and those who understood only the quarterly accounts. In 2007, Antiocho's contract came up for renewal. The compensation package he requested, reflecting his role in developing the online strategy and stabilizing the business, was rejected under Akan's influence. Antiocho departed. His replacement was a man named Jim Keyes, who had most recently run the American convenience store chain 7-Eleven. Keyes was competent within his area of experience. That area of experience had nothing to do with the streaming revolution that was already, by 2007, beginning to reshape how people consumed entertainment. In an interview given shortly after taking the Blockbuster role, Keyes stated publicly that he did not see Netflix as a meaningful competitive threat. He also expressed skepticism about the long-term viability of digital downloading as a primary entertainment delivery mechanism. These statements were not made in private. They were made in the press. Netflix's employees reportedly printed them out and pinned them to the office walls in California as motivational material. Keyes reversed the no late fee policy. He reduced investment in Blockbuster Online. He redirected the company's focus toward its physical stores, adding convenience items, snacks, and entertainment products to the retail mix in an attempt to reposition Blockbuster as a broader entertainment destination rather than a pure rental service. The strategy reflected a fundamental misreading of why people came to Blockbuster. They did not come for the snacks, they came for the ritual. And the ritual was precisely what streaming was in the process of making unnecessary. In the United Kingdom, the consequences of these American boardroom decisions arrived with a delay of approximately 2 to 3 years, filtered through the structural separation of Blockbuster UK from its parent company. But they arrived. Store investment dried up. The online service was underfunded. The late fee, abolished briefly, returned in modified form. Franchise owners who had been asking questions since 2003 were now getting answers they had not wanted. Not in the form of corporate communications, but in the form of declining stock deliveries, reduced marketing support, and the unmistakable administrative atmosphere of a company contracting rather than growing. The people who felt this most acutely were not the executives. They were the staff. A store manager working in a Blockbuster in the English Midlands during this period, one of dozens whose accounts have since been shared in interviews, online forums, and local newspaper features, described the experience in terms that carry a specific weight. The signs were not dramatic. They were mundane, which made them worse. Replacement stock that took longer to arrive than it used to. Maintenance requests for broken shelving or faulty lighting that went unanswered for weeks. The regional manager visits that became less frequent, then stopped. The sense, gradually accumulating, that the people above you in the organization had stopped believing in what you were doing. Even as you continued to open the store each morning, serve the customers, restock the shelves, and maintain, through professional habit and personal pride, the appearance of normality. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people who built this? The franchise owners had invested real money. In some cases, life savings. In some cases, remortgage houses. They had signed agreements with a company that had subsequently been acquired, debt-loaded, mismanaged, and driven toward insolvency by decisions made in American boardrooms that had nothing to do with the loyalty of British customers or the quality of British operations. The franchise agreement gave them a brand and a system. It did not give them protection from what the brand's American parent chose to do with the debt. By 2009, Blockbuster Inc. in the United States was carrying approximately $900 million in long-term debt. The company that had been profitable in 1994 before Viacom arrived was now spending more on debt service than many of its competitors spent on their entire operations. Netflix, meanwhile, had crossed 10 million subscribers and was preparing the technology infrastructure for a transition from postal delivery to streaming. The red envelopes in the post were already becoming a transitional medium, a bridge between the video shop and the internet. Blockbuster was competing against the bridge while the destination was being built behind it. In September 2010, Blockbuster Inc. had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. The filing listed assets of approximately $1 billion against liabilities of nearly $1.5 billion. It was not, in the end, a surprise. The only question that remained was what would happen to the stores in America and in Britain and to the people who worked in them. That question was about to be answered, and the answer was coming fast. The news reached most Blockbuster UK employees the way bad news travels in the digital age. Not through an internal communication, not through a meeting called by management, but through a notification on a phone, a news alert, a text from a friend who had seen it online, a customer walking through the door and asking, with genuine concern rather than malice, whether it was true. In September 2010, Blockbuster Inc. filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States. The British operation was legally separate from the American parent, a distinction that Blockbuster UK's management emphasized in the days following the filing, correctly noting that the UK business continued to trade and was not directly subject to the American proceedings. The reassurance was accurate in its narrow legal sense. In every practical sense, it was the beginning of the end. The American bankruptcy changed everything about Blockbuster UK's position. The parent company's ability to support the British operation, financially, operationally, strategically, was now subject to the constraints of a Chapter 11 restructuring process overseen by an American court. Investment that might otherwise have supported store refurbishment, stock procurement, or digital development was frozen or redirected. The brand that franchisees had licensed and corporate staff had built their careers around was now legally distressed. The blue and yellow sign had not changed. The stores had not closed, but the ground beneath them had fundamentally shifted. The first formal administration of Blockbuster UK came in 2011. The filing affected a portion of the estate rather than the entire operation, and the company emerged from administration having closed a number of stores and restructured some of its obligations. To a customer passing a surviving Blockbuster on a Saturday morning in 2011, nothing visible had changed. The lights were still on, the membership card still worked at the counter, but the number of stores was smaller, the stock was thinner, and the staff who remained were working with the particular controlled composure of people who have been told that things are fine and have chosen, for the time being, to believe it. What was happening inside those stores during this period has since been described by the people who lived it in terms that are consistent in their quiet dignity and their underlying sadness. Shifts continued to be covered. Opening procedures continued to be followed. The new release wall was stocked with whatever had arrived that week, which was not always everything that should have arrived. The returns were sorted and reshelved. The customers who came were served with the same professionalism that had always characterized the better Blockbuster staff. The difference was in the things that were not said, the regional manager who no longer visited, the maintenance request that had been submitted 3 times without response, the question of what happened next that circulated in every staff room in every store in Britain and was never satisfactorily answered. The second administration came in January 2013. This one was different in character and in consequence. The administrator appointed was Deloitte, and the process they oversaw was not a restructuring with the intention of continuing the business in its existing form. It was a managed wind-down, an attempt to sell whatever could be sold, close whatever could not, and distribute whatever remained to the creditors who were owed it. Gordon Brothers, an American restructuring firm specializing in retail liquidations, acquired the remaining Blockbuster UK estate. Their business was not operating video rental shops. Their business was closing them efficiently. The store closure announcements came in waves through 2013. Each wave was reported in the local press of the affected towns with a combination of genuine public regret and the slightly bewildered tone that accompanies the loss of something that had seemed permanent. Blockbuster in the high street closing after 20 years. The headlines were variations on a theme, repeated across Britain from January to November of that year, each one representing a specific building, a specific staff team, a specific set of regular customers who would need to find somewhere else to spend their Friday evenings. Although by 2015, of course, many of them already had. The liquidation sale was the visible face of the collapse, and it had a quality that those who witnessed it have found difficult to forget. The Everything Must Go banners appeared in the windows of stores that had, weeks earlier, displayed new release posters and promotional materials. Inside the shelving units that had held thousands of VHS cases and DVD boxes for 20 years were now sparsely populated with stock price for clearance. £5, £3, 2 for £5, 50 pence for a previously viewed copy of something nobody particularly wanted. The cases were picked over by customers who came partly for the bargain and partly, if they were honest with themselves, for something harder to name, a last connection with a place they had visited for years. An impulse to take something physical away from a space that was about to become empty. The membership card displays still stood near the entrance in some stores. No new members were being signed up. The laminated cards behind the plastic slots were simply there, a retail fixture that had not yet been dismantled, pointing toward a function that no longer existed. Staff managed the liquidation with a professionalism that, under the circumstances, was remarkable. They answered questions about closing dates and final sale terms. They directed customers to the remaining stock. They processed transactions at counters that would soon be removed. They did this in stores where, in many cases, the final redundancy terms had not yet been clearly communicated, where the question of what they were owed for years of service was still being worked through by administrators with priorities that did not begin with the welfare of hourly paid retail workers. The redundancy packages that eventually materialized were, in several documented cases, below what employees had expected based on their length of service. Workers who had been with the company for a decade or more found that the administration process affected the obligations owed to them, a legal reality of insolvency that did not make it any less personally devastating for the individuals involved. Is this how a piece of British life is supposed to end? With a closing down sale and a thank you for your custom sign on the door? The final Blockbuster store in the United Kingdom closed in Uxbridge, in West London, in November 2013. The choice of location carried an accidental symmetry. The first British Blockbuster had opened in South Ruislip, a few miles away, in 1989. 24 years between opening and closing, in the same corner of West London where it had all begun. The closing of the Uxbridge store was not a major national news event. There was no ceremonial final rental, no queue around the block of customers making a sentimental last visit. A handful of journalists came. A few photographs were taken of the emptied shelves and the removed signage. Some local customers stopped to look through the window. The tone of the coverage was elegiac rather than outraged. A recognition that something familiar had ended, delivered with the mild melancholy that the British tend to reserve for the passing of things that were part of daily life rather than high drama. The last film rented from the last Blockbuster in Britain is not recorded in any official document. Nobody thought to mark it at the time. Whoever stood at that counter in Uxbridge in November 2013 and handed over their membership card for the last time almost certainly did not know that what they were doing would be the final transaction in a 24-year chapter of British retail and domestic life. They were probably just returning something. They were probably in a hurry. The door beeped when they left, the same beep it had made for every customer who had walked through it for 2 decades. And then the store was quiet. Outside on the street, the blue and yellow sign remained for a few more days before it was taken down. The building did not stay empty for long. It never does. Something else moved in, as something else always does, and the space was repurposed for a different kind of transaction, serving different needs, carrying no memory of what it had been before. That is how it ended. Not with a final reel, Not with credits, not with a score rising beneath the last image, just a door closing, a sign coming down, and a Saturday morning that arrived, as Saturday mornings always do, with or without anywhere particular to go. The stores closed, the signs came down. And then, as happens with all losses that arrive gradually rather than suddenly, Britain adjusted. The adjustment was not dramatic. There was no single moment of collective reckoning, no national conversation about what had been lost and what might replace it. Blockbuster UK's disappearance was absorbed into the general texture of a high street that was already changing in multiple directions simultaneously. Independent shops closing, charity shops multiplying, betting shops appearing where other businesses had been, the slow reconfiguration of British retail that had been underway since the mid-2000s and would continue long after Blockbuster was gone. The blue and yellow units were repainted, refitted, and reopened as something else. In most cases, the something else was less interesting than what it replaced. A payday loan shop, a vaping outlet, a discount food retailer, the standard succession of the struggling British high street, indifferent to history. Netflix UK had launched in January 2012, 23 months before the last Blockbuster in Britain closed its doors. The timing was not incidental. By the end of 2013, Netflix UK had accumulated approximately 2 million subscribers. By 2015, that number had grown to over 4 million. By 2020, it exceeded 10 million. The company that Reed Hastings had tried to sell to Blockbuster for $50 million in 2000 was now in Britain alone, serving an audience larger than Blockbuster UK had reached at its absolute peak. The mathematics of the reversal are not subtle. Amazon Prime Video arrived in the UK in 2014, Disney Plus in 2020, Apple TV Plus in the same year. The streaming landscape that replaced Blockbuster was not one thing but many. A proliferation of competing services, each carrying its own library, each requiring its own subscription, each arriving on a screen that required no journey, no membership card, and no decision made in common with another person. The friction that Blockbuster had represented, the drive to the shop, the browsing of the shelves, the negotiation over what to watch, was gone entirely. In its place was frictionlessness, instant access, everything available at once, with an algorithm standing ready to tell you what to choose if the choosing itself felt like too much. What the independent video shops had known, and what Blockbuster had been too large to remember, was that curation mattered. The specialist shops that survived Blockbuster's closure were the ones that had never tried to compete with it on scale. Videosyncratic in Edinburgh, 20th Century Flicks in Bristol, a handful of others scattered across Britain's larger cities, each one stocking films that the algorithm would never surface, each one staffed by people who had watched everything on the shelves and had opinions about all of it. These shops did not merely survive the streaming era. Some of them quietly thrived in it, serving customers who had grown tired of scrolling through 10,000 options and finding nothing they actually wanted to watch. The paradox of streaming abundance is that it can produce a form of choice paralysis that a well-curated shelf of 200 films never did. The independent shops understood this. They had always understood it. Blockbuster, at its height, had 800 stores and had forgotten it entirely. The franchise owners who had invested in Blockbuster-branded stores faced outcomes that varied considerably depending on their individual circumstances. Some had structured their operations conservatively enough or had seen the warning signs early enough to exit before the final collapse with their finances intact. Others were not so fortunate. The combination of declining footfall, reduced corporate support, and the administrative process that followed the 2013 insolvency left some franchise operators holding commercial leases on properties that no longer generated the revenue to justify them, alongside redundancy obligations to staff that the administration had not fully discharged. The stories of individual franchise owners from this period are not widely told. They do not appear in the business school case studies or the documentary films. They are the private losses that accumulate in the background of any large corporate failure. The people who built something real with borrowed money and trusted that the company whose name was above the door understood its own business. The workers who lost their jobs in 2013 dispersed into the broader labor market with varying degrees of difficulty. Retail experience transfers to a point. Customer service skills are portable, but the specific combination of film knowledge, operational familiarity, and the quiet expertise of running a busy rental shop on a Friday evening is not a qualification that appears on any standard job application form. The people who were good at working in Blockbuster, and many of them were genuinely good at it in ways that mattered to the customers they served, took that expertise with them into jobs that had no use for it. The broader lesson that Blockbuster's collapse delivered to the retail and entertainment industries was one that was simultaneously obvious and widely ignored in the years that followed. A business that treats its customers as a captive audience, charging late fees, resisting digital adaptation, prioritizing debt service over service quality, will eventually find that the captivity was voluntary. Customers who had no alternative had been tolerating what they disliked about Blockbuster for years. The moment an alternative appeared in the form of a red envelope arriving through the letterbox with no late fee attached, the tolerance expired. The loyalty that Blockbuster's executives had assumed was structural turned out to be conditional. It was not a love of Blockbuster that had kept customers coming back. It was the absence of anything better. This lesson was not learned quickly or completely by the industries that inherited Blockbuster's customers. The music industry had to be forced through a comparable reckoning by iTunes and then Spotify. The newspaper industry was still resisting its equivalent disruption a decade after Blockbuster closed. The assumption that a dominant physical format was a permanent competitive advantage, that scale and familiarity and habit constituted a moat, turned out to be false in every sector where it was tested. In Bend, Oregon, a single Blockbuster store continued to operate. It had survived the American bankruptcy, the store closure waves, and the complete disappearance of the industry it represented through a combination of community loyalty, local ownership, and the particular stubbornness of a small town that had decided collectively to keep the thing it remembered. By 2018, it was the last Blockbuster on Earth. By 2020, it had become a tourist destination. People driving hours out of their way to stand in front of a functional video rental shop, to hold a DVD case under strip lighting, to pay a rental fee at a counter staffed by a real person who had opinions about the stock. Netflix, in an act of corporate irony so complete that it requires no editorial comment, made a documentary about the Ben store in 2020. The last Blockbuster on Earth was commemorated by the company that had destroyed the chain it belonged to. The Ben store's owner, Sandy Harding, received the attention with the dry good humor of someone who had been saying for years that the thing everyone else had abandoned was still worth having. What do we lose when the place where we chose our Friday night disappears, and the algorithm just chooses for us instead? The answer is not simply convenience. Convenience was gained clearly and substantially by the transition from physical rental to streaming. The answer is something more specific and more difficult to replace. What was lost was the shared act of choosing, the standing together in front of a wall of options and deciding, through negotiation and compromise and occasional argument, what the evening would hold. Streaming delivered the film. It did not deliver the Friday night, and it is the Friday night, not the film, that the people who remember Blockbuster are actually mourning when they find themselves, as many of them do, unexpectedly moved by the sight of a membership card at the bottom of a kitchen drawer. The Ben store still operates. It rents films to people who drive there deliberately, who choose to experience the thing that used to be ordinary and is now extraordinary purely through its survival. It is a monument and a curiosity and, on a Friday evening, a working video shop, the last one on Earth. Everything else is gone, and something in the going was lost that streaming has not replaced and the algorithm cannot supply. It is a Friday evening in 1997. The car is parked outside. Someone is already out of the door before the engine has fully stopped, pulling at the handle with the impatience of a person who has been thinking about this moment since mid-afternoon. The entrance sensor beeps as the door opens. That specific, unremarkable sound that meant arrival, that meant the evening had officially begun. Inside, the light is bright and flat and completely familiar. The carpet is dark blue underfoot. The air carries its particular combination of plastic and warmth, and something faintly sweet from the counter near the door. The new release wall is ahead, always the first place to look, always the measure of whether the evening was going to be straightforward or complicated, by the discovery that the film you had discussed on the way over was already gone. Someone picks up a case, reads the back, puts it down, picks up another. Somewhere in the family section, a child has already identified what they want and is now constructing the argument for why their choice should be the one. Somewhere near the action shelves, a couple is conducting the quiet negotiation that has been conducted in this store, in this aisle, on this day of the week, by thousands of couples before them. The staff member behind the counter knows several of the customers by name, not because she was trained to know them, because they come every week, and some things you simply learn. The case is chosen. The membership card comes out of the wallet. Slightly warped, the barcode faded at one edge from years of scanning. The transaction takes 30 seconds. The case goes into a bag. The door beeps again on the way out. The evening is settled. The drive home is already better than the drive there, because now there is something to look forward to, and the looking forward is half the pleasure. That moment is gone, not faded, not diminished, not relocated to a different format. Gone. The specific quality of it, the physicality, the shared decision, the weight of the case in the hand, the sound of the door, exists now only in the memory of the people who were there, which means it is alive for perhaps another 30 or 40 years, and then it will be gone in a different and more final sense. What Blockbuster gave to Britain was not, in the end, a service. Services can be replaced, and this one was replaced, efficiently and completely, by something faster and cheaper and available without leaving the house. What Blockbuster gave to Britain was a ritual, and rituals are not replaceable in the way that services are, because they are not primarily functional. They are social. They are the repeated acts through which people organize their time together, signal to each other what matters, and create the small shared memories that accumulate over years into something that feels like a life. The Friday night ritual that Blockbuster anchored for nearly 2 decades was one of the most democratic leisure experiences that modern Britain produced. It required no cultural capital, no advance booking, no particular income. A family with very little could stand in the same aisle as a family with a great deal and have an identical experience. The membership card cost nothing meaningful to obtain. The rental fee was affordable by almost any standard. The choice available was the same choice available to everyone. In a country where access to culture has historically been rationed by class and income and education, the video rental shop was genuinely, practically egalitarian. You came in. You chose. You went home. Nobody asked who you were or where you had been to school. The people who built Blockbuster UK deserve to be remembered alongside the people who ran it and the people who shopped in it. The staff who worked Saturday morning restock shifts for wages that reflected none of the affection customers felt for the brand. The franchise owners who mortgaged real things, houses, savings, futures, to operate stores in towns across Britain, who built genuine local relationships and provided genuine local employment, and who were ultimately undone by decisions made in Dallas and New York that had nothing to do with the quality of what they had built. The regional managers who drove between stores in the rain and tried to maintain standards in a company that was quietly abandoning the infrastructure those standards required. The people who answered the phone at the membership helpline, and the people who swept the car park, and the people who, on the last day of the last store, came to work anyway and served whoever came through the door with the same courtesy they had always offered. They did not fail. The company failed. The distinction matters. The membership card is still out there. Somewhere in Britain, in a kitchen drawer in Leeds, in a coat pocket in Cardiff, in a box that has not been opened since a house move in 2009, there is a small laminated rectangle, blue and white, slightly warped with a barcode down one side that no longer opens anything. It carries a number that was, for a period of years, the key to a Friday evening. It was scanned hundreds of times at dozens of counters by staff who handed back a film and said enjoy it with the mild sincerity of people who meant it. The card does not open anything now, but it remembers the person who carried it, the one who drove to the shop on a Friday night, who stood in the aisle arguing over genres, who came home with something in a bag and put the kettle on and settled in for the evening with the particular contentment of a person who has made a small, good choice in the company of people they love. Blockbuster is gone. The Friday nights it made possible are not. They live in the people who had them, in the specific texture of those evenings, in the sound of the door, in the weight of the case, in the drive home with something to look forward to. Nobody sends that experience anymore. But it was real. It was warm. It was thoroughly, completely British. And it was worth having.